He built a temple that blinded visiting kings with gold, then climbed a hill east of that temple and lit fires to other gods. That single contrast carries the whole paradox. The same hands that lifted prayers in Jerusalem raised altars for Chemosh and Moloch. The same brain that uttered 3,000 proverbs imported war horses from Egypt after being warned not to. The same man called the wisest in Israel looked at the law of his own covenant and walked past the warning labels in slow motion. Nothing about Solomon's story fits the tidy version that slips into children's books. The record in Kings sharpens like a blade. It names the numbers. It notes the dates. It documents the shine and the smoke. Then it leaves a bruise. The story opens with a scene that seems impossible to ruin. A young king stands at Gibeon before a bronze altar. He admits his inexperience. He asks for discernment to govern a thick-necked people. The request pleases the Lord. Wisdom is granted, and then more riches, honor, length of days if he walks straight. The contract feels ironclad. The early years glow with that promise. Israel's borders are quiet. Judah and Israel live in safety. The daily rhythm of life runs under a canopy of cedar beams and royal confidence. The laughter of a united people spills into the open courtyards of a new king. This is when the stories of genius begin to ripple outward. His verdict between two mothers with one living infant travels the highways like a trumpet. It is recorded, so the reader cannot miss the effect. All Israel hears and is awed, because they see that the wisdom of God sits inside their king for justice. Administratively, he is a machine. 12 district governors supply the royal table month by month. The northern tribute does not crush Judah every season. The army rests. The nation breathes. Solomon composes proverbs by the hundreds and songs by the thousand. He catalogues trees from the cedar in Lebanon to the hyssop in a wall. He names animals with curiosity that feels almost Edenic. He does not just rule people. He studies creation. Inside this golden stretch sits a quiet set of warnings that most readers miss. Deuteronomy had told Israel's future kings to copy the Torah by hand, to read it daily, to avoid multiplying horses, wives, and piles of silver and gold, and to refuse to bring horses out of Egypt. That ancient paragraph reads like a fuse rolled into Solomon's story long before his birth. The rest of the narrative will hum against it. Every economic triumph will brush the edge of that law. Every diplomatic marriage will click into one of those banned categories. He knows the text. He would have known the ink. What follows is not ignorance. It is drift. 4 years into his reign, Solomon launches the project that will define him for 1,000 years. He breaks ground on the house of the Lord in the month of Ziv, in the 480th year after the Exodus. The measurements are meticulous. The structure is only about 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet high, but it gleams because he lines the interior with gold. Hiram of Tyre supplies cedar, cypress, and craftsmen. The stones are finished at the quarry, so the site hears no hammer or chisel. 2 massive cherubim stretch their wings wide inside the inner sanctuary. Then, in the 7th month of the dedication year, fire and cloud overwhelm the space. Priests cannot stand to minister because glory fills the house. Solomon dedicates with prayers that bind heaven to earth, asking for mercy when Israel sins and turns back. Feast days turn into an ocean of sacrifices. The city swells with joy. That day feels like completion. It is not. 7 years for the temple finish, then 13 years for his palace. He builds the house of the forest of Lebanon with 4 rows of cedar pillars. He raises halls, a throne room paneled in cedar, quarters for Pharaoh's daughter whom he has married, and other compounds. Much of this lands within the boundaries of wisdom and blessing. It also starts the first cracks in the story's foundation. The chronicler will describe this period with optimism, but the historian in Kings slips in a key detail. Adoniram oversees forced labor. Solomon drafts 30,000 men in shifts of 10,000. to cut timber in Lebanon, 70,000 burden bearers, and 80,000 stone cutters work in the hill country. This is not the slavery of Egypt, but it is mandatory service. The project absorbs bodies for 2 decades. Then gold pours into Jerusalem like a river. The annual intake recorded in Kings stands at 666 talents of gold, not counting additional revenue sources. That number sits in the text like a drumbeat. It weighs on the reader who knows later literature that will charge that number with terrible meaning. In Solomon's day, it simply signals volume. He builds a great throne of ivory overlaid with gold. 6 steps lead up to it. 12 lions stand beside the 6 steps. Nothing like it exists in any other kingdom. Silver becomes as common as stone in Jerusalem. Shields of hammered gold hang on walls. The cupbearers lift vessels that sparkle. Housewives in a market tell their children that they live in the greatest age their nation will ever see. It feels inevitable. The Queen of Sheba arrives and confirms the reputation from a distance. She comes with spices, gold, and precious stones. She tests him with riddles that he answers with calm ease. She walks through the palace complex and watches the procession of servants in their garments, the burnt offerings in the temple, the order of the table. Breath leaves her. She says the reports did not tell half. She gives a huge quantity of gold and spices unseen since. Solomon gives in return all she desires and requests, beyond what she brings. Both monarchs sense they are watching an apex. While the ports, caravans, and royal halls hum, the text multiplies warning flags. Solomon loves many foreign women. The list is precise. Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, Hittite. 700 wives who are princesses, and 300 concubines. The Torah had said not to multiply wives. It also said foreign wives would turn a king's heart after their gods. Late in life, Solomon's heart bends. He builds high places to Ashtoreth of the Sidonians, to Milcom of the Ammonites. He goes after Chemosh of Moab and Molech of Ammon. The site he chooses sits east of Jerusalem, on the ridge that will carry a new label in the prophets' mouths, the hill of corruption. The irony borders on unbearable. The smoke of idols rises within sight of the house that once choked with divine glory. The man who wrote lines about the fear of the Lord now funds other altars. Other choices compound the drift. In an era when the king of Israel is told specifically not to import horses from Egypt, Solomon builds a trade that brings chariots and horses from Egypt and Kuwait. He stockpiles 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses. He stations them in chariot cities like Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer, and with him in Jerusalem. He funnels wealth and military hardware along the same highways Moses once walked away from. In the process, he becomes exactly what Deuteronomy tried to restrain, a Near Eastern super king who trusts numbers and alliances more than commandments. The irony is not accidental. The text uses it like a mirror. Then Kings shifts tone and ratchets the tension. The Lord is angry with Solomon because his heart turned from the God who had appeared to him twice and commanded him about these very matters. The verdict falls with surgical precision. The kingdom will tear, not in Solomon's lifetime. For David's sake, one tribe will remain. For David's son, for Jerusalem's sake, the rest will go to another. The narrative immediately sets adversaries in motion. Hadad the Edomite flees to Egypt earlier, grows under Pharaoh's protection, and returns as a thorn. Rezon, son of Eliada, gathers men and becomes the ruler of Aram in Damascus, an oppressor of Israel all Solomon's days. These names surface like symptoms that the body is not healthy. No battle scenes fill the scroll with gore. The pressure simply rises. Something has shifted from the days when Solomon's dominion stretched peaceably. The future fracture arrives through a worker from Ephraim named Jeroboam. He oversees forced labor for the house of Joseph and proves industrious. A prophet named Ahijah meets him on a road outside Jerusalem. Ahijah wears a new garment. He tears it into 12 pieces and gives 10 to Jeroboam. He speaks the Lord's word that 10 tribes will split from David's line, because Solomon has bowed to foreign gods. The prophet repeats the reason, so the history will judge the choice. The consequence is set. Solomon seeks to kill Jeroboam, and Jeroboam flees to Egypt under Pharaoh Shishak. The story becomes a chain. Egypt shelters the rebel who will rise later. The gate through which Israel escaped in the Exodus becomes a safe house for the future enemy of Solomon's line. During this time, Solomon continues to build. He invests in fleets at Ezion-Geber, on the shore of the Red Sea, near Eloth, in the land of Edom. Hiram's men sail with his men. They bring gold from Ophir. They return with almug wood and precious stones. The scenes feel epic and smooth. The prophetic word sits behind them, like a shadow. The record of Proverbs leans closer, and the paradox tightens. Many proverbs are Solomonic by attribution. Their themes grow clear. The fear of the Lord anchors knowledge. Pride precedes falls. Adultery destroys. Wealth without righteousness is brittle. Wisdom calls at the city gates and invites the simple to turn in. This is not cynicism. This is not lethargy. The lines ring with clarity and conviction. Then Ecclesiastes comes into the frame, the book that names life under the sun as vapor. Tradition sees Solomon, or at least the Solomonic voice in the preacher's persona, and the text stacks images of palaces, gardens, concubines, wine, and great works before saying all of it dissolves like breath on a cold day. That voice says the more knowledge a person has, the more grief sits with it. The conclusion pushes the listener to fear God and keep his commandments. The man who built altars for foreign gods leaves his readers that conclusion, whether he wrote the words or whether a later sage took up his persona to teach it. The paradox presses harder. The psychology of the story lands with force that feels modern. People reason wisely for others and poorly for themselves. Scholars now give that pattern a name and study it in laboratories, but the phenomenon stands clear in Solomon's day without a journal article. He delivers justice in cases that are not his own. He instructs sons to avoid the adulteress. He warns rulers not to trust riches. He urges diligence and humility. Then his personal decisions carve grooves in the opposite direction. He multiplies marriages until faithfulness blurs. He stacks silver and gold until counting loses meaning. He imports machines of war from the very nation his scripture named as a no-go trade. The distance between a sage's counsel and a king's indulgence becomes a canyon. His early prayer for a listening heart was real. His later drift was also real. Wisdom in the mouth does not automatically become wisdom in the bloodstream. Pressure builds under the surface. The northern tribes feel the strain of labor and taxes. Solomon's detente with the nations depends on gifts and deals, not covenant purity. The house of David begins to feel less like David and more like any other dynasty. The law's commands about kings exist precisely to block this slide. Solomon reads them and steps over them one at a time. The reader can sense the sages of Israel trying to teach their grandchildren by embedding this exact story into the national memory. The story itself becomes a proverb. A single city with a wall is better than a man without self-control. Israel in Solomon's day had walls. Solomon in old age did not. Archaeology elbows its way into the conversation that modern listeners love. Some ruins at sites like Megiddo, Gezer, and Hazor display six-chambered gates and monumental casemate walls that early 20th century archaeologists associated with Solomon's building projects, echoing the note that he fortified those cities. Ongoing scholarship debates the dates and the attributions. Some layers are pushed earlier or later by different schools. The shovel argues with the text, then sometimes nods in its direction. What remains uncontested is the literary picture. A king channeling resources into urban centers, chariot cities, and storage facilities. The biblical author wants the reader to see expansion and centralization than to trace a straight line from centralization, without obedience, to a crack in social trust. The record does not dwell on Solomon's death. It states it with stark brevity. He slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. Rehoboam his son reigned in his place. Then the drumbeat accelerates. The man who fled to Egypt returns. Jeroboam stands with the assembly at Shechem and asks for a lighter yoke. Rehoboam consults elders who advise gentleness and restraint. He rejects their advice and speaks with arrogant bravado learned among young courtiers. The result is immediate. 10 tribes cry out that David has no portion with them. They head for their tents. The dynasty loses control of the north in a single day. Jeroboam establishes Bethel and Dan as new worship sites, creates 2 golden calves, and tells the people that these are the gods who brought them up from Egypt. He crafts a new priesthood and new feasts. The rot spreads. The scholar who reads the split sees Solomon's choices not as private lapses but as national seeds. Deuteronomy's warnings about kings were not personal piety suggestions. They were the ballast that held together political and spiritual life. Without them, the ship rolls. The role of Egypt resurfaces. Pharaoh Shishak invades in Rehoboam's 5th year, plunders Jerusalem, and carries off treasures from the temple and the royal palace. The shields of gold leave. Rehoboam makes bronze replacements. The tangible downgrade from gold to bronze in the palace guard's hands reads like a moral downgrade in metal. Outside the Bible, a relief at Karnak lists towns conquered by Shishak. The carving stands like granite confirmation that the biblical writer is not composing fairy tales. The storm-touched stone. The thread connecting Solomon's 66 talents of gold to the loss of gold shields is not a coincidence of image. The text uses those numbers and objects to teach. Abundance without fear of God becomes a trap that snaps shut. The people who once could not even walk into the temple because of glory end up watching priests serve under a diminished glow. The covenant was never a magic spell. It was a relationship with moral structure. When Solomon walked within it, the nation shone. When he stepped out, even the brilliance of his mind could not arrest the slide. The charge that Solomon was foolish lands hardest when measured against his own words. He wrote that the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. He taught that a soft answer turns away wrath. He penned warnings about strange women, deceptive riches, and sluggards turning on their bed like a door on hinges. He observed ants and stored lessons in lines that children still recite. The gifted mind saw patterns that others missed. Then, under the weight of 1,000 small permissions, he allowed his heart to migrate. Old age did not save him. Seniority did not sanctify him. Power did not purify him. His most striking early example of discernment, the case of the 2 women and the 1 living infant, plays like a parable of his life. In that moment he discerns the true mother and exposes the counterfeit by calling for a test. He has the distance and courage to cut through manipulation. He reads the soul of a stranger accurately. Decades later, he cannot read the gravitational pull of his own alliances. He can direct other lives cleanly. He cannot direct his own. That pattern is the paradox now quoted by psychologists and pastors. Wisdom as a public service and foolishness as a private practice can live in the same human package for years. The Bible refuses to hide that fact behind a halo. Solomon's dedication prayer at the temple included lines that predicted exile and restoration if Israel or its kings sinned and turned back. He had the categories in his mouth from the start. The 2 theophanies he experienced encounters where the Lord appeared to him were vivid. They contained promises clipped to commands. If you walk, I will establish. If you turn aside, I will cut off. Those if-then statements were never vague. When the cutting began, the reader already knew why. The author of Kings writes with a theological backbone. History in this book is moral. The narrative whispers about his internal state at the end, and then goes quiet. Later, Jewish tradition wrestles with whether he repented. Some midrashic lines imagine a humbled king wandering as a beggar, repenting and repeating that all is vanity. Others defend him against the charge of permanent apostasy. The canonical text does not open that window. It leaves him buried and lets the consequences step onto the stage after him. That silence functions as a warning. It pushes readers not to romanticize the final pages. It holds the camera on the torn cloak handed to Jeroboam and the bronze shields. It refuses closure with neat repentant scenes. The paradox remains on screen. The contrasts around wealth and worship frame other details that many modern readers skip. The Hebrew word for wisdom implies skill, craftsmanship in thought. Solomon's craftsmanship built liturgy with choirs and instruments that David had arranged. He appointed priests and Levites to their divisions. He maintained festival rhythms. He honored public worship with discipline. But he used the same skill to build shrines on the hill east of Jerusalem that would haunt the city for generations. Later kings would desecrate and pulverize those high places to cleanse the land. The hill received a new name because of him. Geography remembered his drift. He ruled at a time when trade routes connected 3 continents. Ships brought sandalwood and gold. Monkeys and peacocks arrived in ports, exotic creatures that delighted the court and fed the identity of a world-savvy regime. Agur and Lemuel outsiders whose wisdom made it into proverbs stand as literary reminders that Israel listened to the nations. Listening can be holy when filtered through covenant faithfulness. Solomon's court had the filter on for years, then turned it off. His marriage to Pharaoh's daughter stands as a trophy alliance that Israelite readers of a later age would examine with narrowed eyes. The Exodus had severed certain bonds. The law had banned Israel from returning to rely on Egyptian horses. Marriage to Pharaoh's daughter carved a diplomatic tunnel back into the house of bondage. The chronicler softens the edge and emphasizes success. Kings keeps the razor. Even Solomon's attempt to respect the ark by not bringing his Egyptian consort into David's city at first reads more like management of contradiction than obedience. In the field of public works, his accomplishments remained unmatched for centuries. Archaeologists and historians take tours through the climate-controlled spaces of ancient museums and talk about Phoenician artists' inlaid ivory into furniture that sat in his palace. They tell the story of Hiram working bronze at a scale Israel had never seen. They point to 4,000 stalls for chariot horses in Chronicles and 12,000 horses in Kings, and attempt to reconcile the numbers. The big story remains the same. He consolidated a small kingdom into a regional force. He harnessed craft, trade, literature, and ritual into one glittering package. Then he planted a worm inside it. His death is a quiet sentence that hides an earthquake. Kings and Chronicles both move on. The reader, however, sees aftershocks everywhere. Within 5 years of his reign's end, Pharaoh Shishak marches. Within a generation, the northern kingdom establishes its own cult and dynasty. Prophets will rise from both kingdoms and speak in a tone that changes the literature of the world. The timeless lines of Isaiah and Hosea draw their first breath under a fractured monarchy. The wisdom books are not isolated. They sit inside a story where kings rise by keeping covenant and fall by breaking it. The number 666 for Solomon's annual gold intake becomes a magnet for later speculation. But the original text uses it plainly. It says that the weight of gold that came in during a single year was 666 talents. The writer saves moral energy for idolatry and covenant breach. The numerology does not need to do heavy lifting to make the point. Wealth was massive. Wealth did not save him. Even the beauty of his temple serves the paradox. That house stood for centuries as the center of Israel's worship. The presence cloud had filled it. The feast of dedication ran longer than planned because the people were too happy to stop. Then, later, invaders would burn and break that same house while prophets cried, "Solomon, The builder started that long, sad arc when he put other altars on the hillside. The scribes who recorded this did not blame God. They blamed kings and people who refused covenant faithfulness. The theology is relentless. Blessing and curse ride on obedience. The tale does not invalidate God's gift. It indicts a king's stewardship. Wisdom arrived by grace. Stewardship needed resolve. David's story provides a foil not because David did not sin. He shattered commandments and broke hearts, but because when confronted, David confessed and reoriented. Kings repeats a line that David followed the Lord wholeheartedly, except in the matter of Uriah. Solomon receives no such epitaph. The summary says his wives turned away his heart. The historian wants the contrast to burn. The father's repentance did not automatically graft into the son's habits. Lineage cannot replace devotion. The theological thread reaches back into the law, where the duties of a king include writing a copy of the Torah and reading it all the days of his life, so that his heart might not be lifted above his brothers, so that he might not turn aside to the right or the left. The detail about writing by hand matters. The king is supposed to slow down and trace letters with ink on parchment. He is supposed to engrave the law into muscle memory. 1,000 small daily choices hang from that act. The storyteller in Kings cannot force the reader to watch Solomon fail at that task. He can place the contrast in the structure of the narrative. The early wisdom scenes and the late high place scenes create a frame that the law text fills. The greatest tragedy in Solomon's story is not that he enjoyed wealth or built big. The greatest tragedy is that he ignored the covenant boundary lines that would have let him enjoy all those things without turning them into idols. The Bible does not preach asceticism here. It preaches ordered love. When love of God collapses, every other good thing becomes a god that cannot save. Horses become security to trust. Gold becomes identity. Wives become political instruments until they become spiritual masters. Everything shifts position in the inner hierarchy. That is the fool's journey, with higher ceilings and more polished floors. After the split, the biblical writers will point back to Solomon any time they want to explain why pain entered their story. Jeroboam becomes the template sinner for the north, but Solomon is the prototype of slow compromise at the top. The Deuteronomistic history. The long narrative from Deuteronomy through Kings reads Solomon's reign as a hinge that squeaks and then fails. The exile centuries later sits inside the same moral arc. The glory days of his early reign are not erased. They are recorded to make the fall sting deeper. The paradox is pedagogical. It trains readers to refuse celebrity worship, to test leaders by obedience, not output. In the New Testament, the name Solomon appears in Jesus' mouth when he says that even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like a lily. The contrast lands like a small sermon. Nature's simple beauty surpasses royal splendor. The teacher uses Solomon as a symbol for what passes away. He does not dismiss the man's wisdom. He relativizes it under the kingdom ethic he is preaching. Ancient glory becomes a lesson in the temporary nature of garments and palaces. The red thread remains. Splendor is not salvation. Solomon's paradox does not end with him. It marches through time. Leaders who speak truth to power in one decade fall to flattery in the next. Writers whose insights save marriages fail in their own homes. Pastors who preach about greed manipulate church budgets to feed their appetites. Politicians who write anti-corruption laws discover loopholes under their own desks. Wisdom shines best when tethered to the fear of the Lord, a phrase the biblical writers defined as loyalty, reverence, and obedience at a cost. When that tether snaps, intellect becomes a tool for rationalization. Solomon shows that lethal alchemy in royal scale. The legacy that remains after the dust settles includes a temple design that still informs art, a wisdom tradition that shapes minds, and a story that refuses to blink. The narrative choice to record both horror and beauty on the same scroll is itself an act of courage. The writer does not protect heroes. He honors the God who outlives them and judges them with justice and mercy. Solomon's paradox becomes a mirror for that God's people in every century. They read about him and check their altars. They count their horses. They test their alliances. They lower their eyes and consider the daily work of copying the law into memory. A final set of images drives the point home. One image shows a young king under stars at Gibeon, pleading for a listening heart. Another shows an old king on a ridge, watching smoke rise from an altar he commissioned to a foreign deity. Two real human moments, with everything at stake. The distance between those two scenes is not measured in miles. It is measured in inches of heart, drift over years. The scriptures do not record a sudden snap, a single decision that rerouted him. They record habits stacked on top of habits, until a mountain formed beneath his feet, and no easy step would return him to the valley where he began. The reader's task does not stop at admiration for his early gifts, or shock at his late failures. The text pushes the reader to build fences around the few commands that matter most. For ancient Israel's kings it meant humility, Torah in hand, purity in marriage, restraint in military hardware, and alms in the place of ambition. For the rest of the people it meant keeping Sabbath, shunning idols, doing justice, loving mercy, and walking humbly. Solomon's reign was a case study delivered by a man with every advantage. Complexity without obedience collapses. Simplicity with fear of the Lord holds. The splendor of his temple would be rebuilt after exile and renovated later. The altars on the hill would be smashed by reformer kings. His proverbs would be recopied by scribes and placed on the lips of children in exile and in return. Even his failure became a gift to later readers. The paradox preserved in his life became a warning line, underlined in red. It taught parents to tell their children that greatness, without gratitude to God, ends in smoke. It taught leaders to memorize the boundaries before the opportunities come. It taught an entire culture that a beautiful beginning does not guarantee a beautiful end. There is a detail about Solomon that often passes quietly. The writer emphasizes that the Lord loved him. That line appears when he receives his second name, Jedediah, as an infant. The love of God did not vanish during his drift. It did not erase consequences either. The two truths exist in the same narrative field. That dual reality carries hope and fear into every generation. It means grace is not a license. It also means judgment is not spite. The God who appears to a young man at Gibeon with an invitation to ask big still sits on the throne during Shishak's raid. The monarch does not manipulate the monarchy of heaven. He never did. Solomon's paradox delivers a riddle with a terrible answer, and then hands the listener a path. The answer names how a man can be globally famous for wisdom and locally addicted to folly. The path points to the fear of the Lord as the beginning of something real. The 3,000 proverbs will keep boiling down to one line. The line will still hold when palaces crumble. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Solomon's life gives the counterexample that proves the rule. It refuses flattery. It announces truth. It becomes a living proverb, written in gold leaf and ashes.